Well, good afternoon. My name is Bill Purcell, and I am the director of the Institute of Politics, and it's my great pleasure to welcome each and every one of you to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum this afternoon. This is once again a full house, and in the house with us, I want to acknowledge the presence of our Dean, David Ellwood, who is so very supportive of the work of all areas of this school, but we believe most especially of our institute. Tonight, as you know, is a conversation with David Plouffe, campaign manager for President Barack Obama's 2008 presidential campaign. David has a very broad political resume, involved in congressional and Senate campaigns in Iowa, Delaware, New Jersey, Illinois, involvement at the national level across states with the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, in a state gubernatorial election here in Massachusetts, in our most recent successful gubernatorial election. Every kind of campaign in almost every kind of place. Much can and will be said, much has and will be written, some of it by David very soon. For tonight, one expert opinion should suffice. Following the election last November, the President of the United States said simply that he built the best political campaign in the history of the United States. The President later said, "I'm not sure there's anybody else who could have done it." As a result, I think there is general agreement that politics will never be the same again, perhaps most especially as it relates to young people. So it is especially appropriate, we think, that tonight we have invited two outstanding Harvard College students to join David Plouffe on stage and begin our conversation. Eva Lam is the president of the Harvard College Democrats. She's a junior at Leverett House, concentrating in social studies. Focus is urban education in the United States, and she plans to teach high school after graduation. This is Eva's second appearance in the forum this academic year. Last fall, she represented the Democrats right here during the debate with the Harvard Republicans. Eva hails from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Malcom Glenn is a senior at Harvard College and the former president of the oldest continuously published college newspaper in the country, the Harvard Crimson. He became the first African-American president of the Crimson in more than 50 years when he led this organization last year. A native of Denver, Colorado, Glenn was actively engaged in last year's presidential race as a pundit, a blogger, and a reporter. He covered the Democratic National Convention in his hometown for a number of news outlets, specifically analyzing how the youth vote would shape the outcome of the election. He'd like to continue his involvement in politics following his graduation in June, and perhaps Mr. Plouffe can help some in that regard as well. Please join me in welcoming Eva, Malcom, and our guest, David Plouffe.
Well, first off, David, thank you so much for joining us. I think everyone here very much appreciates you being here. A lot of the students who wanted to work on the Obama campaign, what we could do best from here at Harvard was go up to New Hampshire. And, you know, as I'm sure you've, talked about and kind of hashed out a great deal on your own, the New Hampshire primary was something we've never seen. It was a polling anomaly that I don't think anyone has really been able to explain to this point. And so what I'm interested to hear, and I think what a lot of other people are interested to hear, was what the heck happened in New Hampshire?
Well, thanks, Malcolm. I'm going to enjoy the dialogue with the two of you. Can we get the mic on? There we go. I want to thank you, Mayor Purcell, for having me here. It's been a great week so far. I'd say first, I think one of the biggest surprises of the whole campaign is that Barack Obama is the 44th president of the United States, having lost the New Hampshire primary. We really thought that to defeat Hillary Clinton, who was such a strong frontrunner and had such staying power, we'd have to win Iowa, and that winning Iowa would most likely lead to a New Hampshire victory. Now, we did not take the lead in New Hampshire in our own polling on Sunday, but we eventually did. And really, by the end, it was clear. The coverage was... The coverage of the election heading into New Hampshire was not whether Obama was going to win. It was how big the margin was. So I don't think any of us can say for sure why we lost. And I would say, before I get into the reasons, I think the fact that we recovered from New Hampshire, again, is one of the surprises of the primary. I think if we had lost a primary where it was heading into Election Day and it was seen as a jump ball, 35 Clinton, 35 Obama, we might have had a tougher time dealing with that. That night it was kind of like, wow, what just happened here? What the heck happened here? Something strange happened here. It's going to take a little time to deal with it, but in a strange way, it was easier to deal with a loss in that standpoint than if this was a jump ball that looked like it was going to be a dead heat. I think a few things happened. I think that there were some pretty tough attacks made on us by our opponent that weekend, that rather than deal with them in a broad way and say, you know, this is the kind of politics we need to reject like we did in Iowa, we kind of dealt with them tactically because we were on a good trajectory. The coverage of those last 4 days for us was all about Obama's triumphant tour through New Hampshire. And even though we were doing a lot of retail campaigning, going to Dunkin' Donuts and shaking hands, the coverage was Obama getting rock star-like crowds while Senator Clinton was out there working it one vote at a time. We probably should have adjusted. I think most importantly, there was two things that were, obviously Hillary's moment of emotion on Monday, it's hard to quantify, but that clearly had an impact. And you've got to remember, Hillary, for most of the campaign, was in the 40s. She was getting a lot of support. She sinks down in the low 30s. So as she bounces back, almost everybody that she got back had been with her at some point and still had favorable views of her. The same thing happened in Iowa with Edwards. Edwards goes all the way from 45, where he started, down to 19. He bounces back up to 30. Almost all of those people he got at the end were Edwards supporters at some point. So Hillary's moment clearly helped bring some of those folks back. I think the fourth thing, and maybe the most important thing, was we were in a subterranean battle with John McCain for independent voters. And we went into the last 4 or 5 days of the primary with many more independents in New Hampshire saying they were going to vote in the Democratic primary than the Republican primary. And what we began to see as that weekend unfolded in the last 48 hours was independents saying, you don't need my help as much as McCain does. You're going to win, so I'm going to go vote for McCain to help him against Romney, and I'll be back to you in the general election. And that was very dangerous. And we probably should have dealt with it a little bit more concretely and said, you know, don't believe the polls. We still need your support. You can't move. And we tried to do some of that tactically. But that was a very dangerous dynamic. And we know from Election Day, there were many people who showed up because we were tracking people very closely. And they said, well, I'm going to go in there and vote for McCain. And so we lost a lot of independents at the end because the McCain-Romney race looked like a dead heat. Our race looked like it was a fait accompli.
Let's move from talking about something that went wrong for the Obama campaign to what went wrong for the Hillary campaign. I don't know how much you can comment on that, but I'd love to get your thoughts on their strategy from the beginning.
Well, first of all, we had such a deep appreciation for her strength in the race. You cannot understand our campaign or our success without understanding. We lived every moment of 2007 and the first couple months of 2008 believing that if we made one big mistake, we were done. We knew that she was so strong. She had such enormous leads, such great political support, such fundraising strength, that we believed that, I really believe 9 times out of 10 you run that primary, she probably wins. We developed an electoral strategy that was one narrow path. We had to win early, and then we thought the race would change. It would reset if we won Iowa. And then we'd have a chance, but only a chance, in a two-way race to beat her. So I think that, you know, she ended up being a very strong candidate, you know, particularly at the end when it was clear that we were in all likelihood going to win. She went out there day after day and was relentless and was driving a positive message. And I think she deserves an enormous amount of credit for that. And, you know, really my respect and admiration for her, even though we were engaged in a very tough campaign group during that period, because I don't think there's many human beings that in that situation would have got up every day and performed that well. I think that a few things. One is I don't think that they probably appreciated the threat that Obama winning Iowa would cause to them. It's true that she was the only candidate in the race that could overcome an early loss. But I don't think she had a full appreciation, or a campaign more likely, for what would happen if we won Iowa. Secondly, I think that it was a change election. And for most of the campaign, it was our message of change versus another message of inevitability in Washington experience. Kind of didn't meet the times. I think that there was a belief in their campaign that the race would be over on February 5th, which was the day of 22 primaries, so-called Super Tuesday. But they really didn't organize in all 22 states. They organized in big states like Massachusetts and Illinois and New Jersey and California, I think with a belief that it would be more of a political victory than a delegate battle. We treated it differently. We viewed it as an aggregation of 1,681 delegates in 22 states. And if we could come close to even, we survived at that moment the greatest threat to our candidacy. We did better than that. We won the day. We won the states and delegates. And that morning of February 6th was the first time I thought we were going to be the Democratic nominee, all things being equal. And you look at that day, New Jersey, a big state, well over 100 delegates at stake. Hillary wins by 10 points. It's a big win. She nets 11 delegates because we learned from delegates that if races are relatively close, you don't win that many delegates. Idaho, tiny Idaho, 18 delegates. We win 15, she wins 3. We net more delegates out of Idaho than New Jersey. And that's really the story of that day. I mean, to talk about it in chess terms, she had queens and kings, we had pawns. But we aggregated enough pawns, and we won the day. So I think now they learned their lesson. You look later, very small example, but it's very illuminating. Wyoming, a state we were going to win, but they campaigned in it. They organized in it. Hillary went there, Bill went there. We still win 58-42. But if we had gotten 62.5% of the vote, we would have gotten an extra delegate. The old way the Clintons dealt with it, we would have, because they wouldn't have campaigned there. And we probably would have gotten 64, 65, or 66. So would we still have won Minnesota and Colorado and Washington State and Nebraska and some of these caucus states? Yes, but the margin wouldn't have been as big. The whole tale of the primary is one of margins. We won a lot of landslides. She won less. Landslides are how you aggregate delegates. And I think the other mistake was a sense that superdelegates somehow would make a decision based on loyalty. But it was clear in our discussion with superdelegates, who we all began to know too much about during the course of the campaign, that they were pretty much going to follow the results of the election. They weren't going to overturn it. And we spent a lot of time messaging that. It was odd. The outside candidate, we were the outside candidate, had to play more of the inside game at the end because it became more about insiders than about voters, which was a terrible place to be and no way to run a primary in my view, but that's the rules we had to deal with. And so we had to make sure that superdelegates understood that's the way we viewed the race, that pledged delegates, the winner of the most pledged delegates, should become the nominee. But she was a worthy opponent. We were a much stronger general election candidate for having tussled with her in her campaign.
David, I have a two-part question. You talked a lot about delegates and the fact that we learned a great deal, probably more than we would have ever imagined about delegates by the end of this campaign. But I think it speaks to something, the fact that we were very, very engaged. But it seems like you were out in front of that in a way that no one else was. And so what I want to know is, how did you know that it was going to come down to that? And what kind of foresight did you look to that no one else was able to look to? And was there something about your previous campaigns, because you've worked on a number of presidential campaigns that weren't successful, and so what about those campaigns also helped shape and inform your experience in 2008?
Well, I think one of the strengths of our campaign is we kind of wiped the slate clean and didn't. Part of that is the way we got into it. Most people who run for president have been planning it for years. They have some sense of how they would run, what their playbook is, what their team is. We got into this very unusual. We were a startup in every truest sense of the word. So we had to build the plane while it was taking off and looked at things anew. I think so. It was less my experience than this. Because we raised more money in the first 6 months of the year than we anticipated, and because our grassroots campaign was building with such strength around the country, we thought we had the ability to begin organizing in states that came after the first 4. Our initial plan was we would only focus on Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, and South Carolina, because that's all we would have the money for. We made a very smart decision, and I put a bunch of money aside and into February 5th states, and we started to build for those. But there was still a good chance that one of us would go on a run of victories in the early states, and the race would be over early, like it is almost every election cycle. But we began to build for the long term. And I think it was when we had a split verdict in Iowa and New Hampshire, I think we really began to think this thing could go on for a very long time. Maybe not till June 3rd, but till March. And at that point, we knew we had a head start because the Clinton campaign was not organized in any number of February 5th states. We were beginning to organize in Virginia and Wisconsin. We thought we'd have money to advertise there. So it was clear that we were behind in all of those states. I mean, people don't have an appreciation for that. After Iowa, we have this big win in Iowa. We poll all the February 5th states. We're down 20 in all of them including the caucus states. The point about the caucus states is that the same people who turned out at caucuses every year turned out, we were going to lose. That's where we had to change the electorate. And I think that's one of the great triumphs of the campaign, is we didn't accept things as they were, the electorate, and said, this is who we got to deal with, so we got to convince enough of them to be for us. We said, we're going to try and add people to the electorate, younger people, disaffected voters, independents, Republicans, higher African-American turnout, and that happened. Iowa was the big example of that. If the caucus electorate that John Kerry won in 2004 had turned out, we might have come in third place. Every caucus going back to 1976, twice as many people over 65 turned out as under 30. Kind of makes sense. Iowa's an older state. Caucuses aren't younger voters' cup of tea. On the night of January 3rd, as many people under 30 turned out as over 65. And that is a remarkable thing. And Iowa, in many ways, was our laboratory. We learned. We spent a year of this 2-year race on Iowa. We learned we could expand the electorate. We learned the power of local messaging coming from our supporters. We learned how effective Barack Obama was on the ground. So I think that even in June, July, August, September, as we're beginning to build in the states that would come after the first 4, I still think the greatest likelihood was one of us would get onto a big winning streak, win Iowa, win New Hampshire, win Nevada, South Carolina, and you'd be in the catbird seat. But there was beginning to be a sense that this could be a protracted fight. And we had the money and, more importantly, the people. Okay? Minnesota, Colorado, Missouri, Alabama. They were not organized by our staff. They were organized by volunteers online organizing their communities. And so when we sent staff into Minnesota, for instance, in September of 2007, the state was already half organized. A remarkable thing. And that happened time and time again.
There's been a lot of talk about how the way that you ran the Obama campaign, both in the primaries and in the general election, was revolutionary. And I absolutely agree that with respect to the number of young voters that campaign organized, with respect to the degree to which it relied on a grassroots organization, with respect to the way in which it changed messaging, it was absolutely revolutionary. But do you think that future campaigns in 2010, in 2012, and 2016, with candidates less charismatic and less exciting than Barack Obama, will be able to continue that model? And if so, what do they have to do?
Well, it's a good question. Every campaign's different. Every year, every candidate. And you cannot replicate what happened in the past. Barack Obama had unique appeal to millions of Americans, had unique appeal to younger voters who just didn't vote for them, but they gave money and they volunteered and they traveled to states. We as a campaign believed in the grassroots in our core. It was how we built our strategy. Why did we go contest Indiana and North Carolina against McCain? Yes, we thought Obama would have enough appeal with independents and Republicans. But it was because we had strong enough grassroots campaigns that you could win what looked like an uphill battle. So it was core to who we were, and our supporters got that. They really believed that Barack Obama and the campaign believed in them and what they were doing, and then it mattered. It wasn't a nice addition. I think many of our supporters by the end believed if they spent one less hour helping out, Obama may not win. By the way, there was some truth to that. This campaign was built on the backs of people who wanted change. So I think this going forward, first of all, if a candidate is saying they have to mean it. Right? You can't just say, I want to run a grassroots campaign because that gives me a good press story. You've got to mean it. Everybody should try. Because getting people involved in politics is good for the country and good for their campaign. Everybody should try and get young people engaged. They should. Whether or not you can do it on the scale Obama did, it's unlikely. So should it be as at the core of your campaign as what we did? I think that's situationally dependent. For many people, it might be. It might be, you know what, volunteers are not going to be the core of how I win the campaign, but I'm going to find a useful place for them and apportion the right amount of resources and time to them. But it should happen. But I think if people did not think that Obama was authentically interested in their role in his campaign, and that our success hinged on their performance, it wouldn't have been the engine that drove our campaign, and it did. So I think that there may be people who claim to be running an internet-based campaign or a grassroots campaign that don't really mean it, that like the soundbite part of it but don't mean it, and they will fail. But everybody should. It proves that it can be done. Here's one thing. I think that one really positive development out of Barack Obama's success will be many more people will run for office who aren't quote-unquote from the establishment. Many more will run. Many won't win, but more will. It proves that you don't need the establishment support to win. And that's a healthy thing for our country. That, in fact, you can fund a campaign and organize a campaign if you've got the right appeal and the right message. If you're offering a challenge to the status quo, you can run, whether that's city council or senate. And I think that's a really important development for our country.
David, I want to talk to you a little bit about organizing for America. It seems like your intent is to transition some of the momentum from the campaign into some of the initiatives that the president is trying to push forward. But it's a little bit more difficult than that because, you know, going out and going door to door and campaigning for a budget isn't the same as going out and campaigning for a really, really charismatic senator from Illinois. And so how do you maintain that momentum, essentially, and what would you say is sort of the grade you would give organizing for America thus far?
Well, I think there's no doubt, first of all, we're not in a political campaign. And there's no doubt that the urgency of an election, all the deadlines that come with that, voter registration deadlines, early vote deadlines, election day, you know, focuses people. I would say this, anything that our grassroots supporters do is a huge bonus because it's never been done before. And really, Organizing for America will do two things. First, and this was never appreciated in the campaign by political observers, and it's not now, if all we did was send over 13 million people messages so they understood Barack Obama's plans and message on the economy, on education, on health care, this is a huge advantage, okay? Because people talking to people was one of the strengths of our campaign. People don't always just accept what the media says, or government says, or an academic institution says, or business. They'll listen to what their neighbor says. Even though they know their neighbor, their colleague, isn't an expert on energy policy, they trust where they're coming from, their values. So we now have a lot of people out there who understood what he was trying to do with the recovery package. So when they would engage in 8 conversations any given day, they say, no, it's going to save or create 3 million jobs. And they're shovel ready. And it's going to help with growth. Right now in the budget, I'll break this down. Somewhere today, many places today, people are discussing current events. And someone will say to one of our supporters who got messages from the president about how to talk about the budget, they'll say, you know, this budget, I'm just not sure, his plans on energy and education, shouldn't we wait on that? Shouldn't we just stabilize the short-term economy? And can we afford to do this? And our supporter says, no, we can't. Let me tell you why. Barack Obama ran for president because he believed on the issues that will determine the strength of this country and for generations to come, energy, education, and health care. Washington has dropped the ball. They've not dealt with this. We've got to get on the right path here. It's going to how we lead to growth, long-term and short-term. It's going to make us a stronger planet, a cleaner planet, bring down health care costs. Secondly, he cuts the deficit in half in 5 years, being much more tough on spending than Bush ever dreamed of. So while he, yes, is investing in the places we need to grow, he's trying to cut the spending. Think about the power of that. That's how people decide things. That's how opinions are formed. That's what's happening. And it's a remarkable tool to have, particularly as mainstream media lessens in importance in terms of its reach. Secondly, we've done a little bit of this, and we're going to do more of it, is to ask people if they want to go out and canvass and make phone calls to build real support, not phony support, to actually go out and talk to people. You know, in Kokomo, Indiana, and Asheville, North Carolina, and say, this is what the president's trying to do on energy, on health care. Do you support it? And build real support. And, you know, right now, you know, there was some surveys to come out recently. We always take polls with a grain of salt. But, you know, 68% of independent voters this week said they trust what the president's trying to do on the economy. That doesn't happen by accident. Part of this is people are out there talking about this amongst themselves. And they're deciding that he's the one person that has a plan for the future that makes sense, that will also stabilize us in the short term. So I think my view is anything OFD does is good for the president and it's great for America. Because people feel divorced from these debates. They think they happen in Washington, a bunch of chattering people on CNN. But they're happening in schools, in diners, in doorsteps, and on phones. And that's a great thing for our country. We need to reconnect people with their democracy and their government, and that's what we're trying to do.
I remember my freshman fall here, the fall of 2006, I was, I think, in this very room when the results of the 2006 midterm elections were announced, and Democrats had made gigantic gains in Congress. And I remember that all the Democrats I was with were jumping around and screaming and saying, yeah, we won, but when they were saying we, they're saying we like I say we when I refer to the Green Bay Packers. In 2008, when we were all out on Mount Auburn and Massachusetts Avenue dancing around in the streets at 2 in the morning, we were saying, yes, we did, but when we said we meant ourselves and our roommates and our friends and our families. How did the Obama campaign create that sense of ownership?
Well, what we did right was I think we had a candidate who believed in building a grassroots campaign, who our supporters and ultimately voters believed that he believed in them. And our campaign was built with the premise that you could talk to people like adults, that their activity could help win an election and change the direction of a country. We believed in younger people when no one else did, that they would turn out and be active. We believed that African American turnout could reach historic levels. We believed that we could get Republicans and independents to give a Democratic nominee a chance. I mean, we won 13% of the vote in Indiana, of the Republican vote. That's why we won Indiana. So I think there was a sense that we trusted people, that we believed they were instrumental in the outcome. But we deserve much less of the credit. It was the people out there, like you, who had those discussions, who said, you know what, I'm gonna lift up a phone here, I'm gonna go door knocking. I'm not gonna just let this election happen, I'm gonna help shape it. And it was a remarkable thing to see. And I think if you were writing a movie or a screenplay about the Obama campaign, someone like me wouldn't manage it. It would be a college professor, a community organizer. I've been around politics for a long time. But it was a joy to be involved in this, because I have never been involved in a campaign. You'd only read about them, where there was this level of activism and engagement. And we viewed our supporters as our partners. I mean, one of the reasons we recovered from New Hampshire was that night, I remember at 2 a.m., looking at our fundraising numbers, and they were just going up. People were ready for the fight. The next day, people say, people are pouring into our campaign offices. Okay, this wasn't, we liked Obama and he had a setback, so we're taking a walk. They were in there. It picked us up. And it was hard to ever get down when you knew that there was millions of people out there who were giving money they could not afford to give, time they did not have to give to our campaign. And they were really, the wind beneath our wings. And it was a great dynamic. And I think it was one of the reasons we were such a healthy campaign, is we did not want to let any of you down. We really thought that this level of engagement was so unique that we had to get across the finish line and win, so that there wasn't disillusionment and discouragement. And so I think that we deserve some credit for our approach and our belief in the tools we gave people, but our supporters deserve almost all the credit, because they made this happen. Our supporters were the art of the possible. It was a remarkable campaign to be part of, where almost anything you wanted to do, you could do. Any voter you wanted to talk to in any state, you could talk to them, because we had such capacity because of our people. I'd also say the makeup was unusual. 50% of the people that gave us money or volunteered had never done so before in politics. That is a remarkable thing, because giving money to a politician, time to somebody running for office, to many of these people seemed foreign. In many ways, it would something they could never imagine themselves doing, but they were doing it. And what's important about that, and also all the independents and Republicans we had, and they were a huge part of our organization. When those of us that are professional political operatives or people who are clear partisans talk about politics with our circle of people that we think we have influence with, we don't have any impact. We give the same song and dance every 2 years about some great Democratic candidate. But when someone who's never lifted their voice before about politics does so, you listen a little bit more closely. And when someone who says, I'm an independent or Republican, I've never voted for a Democrat, and I've certainly never volunteered for one, but I am for Barack Obama, and let me tell you why, people lean in a little bit more closely. And that was always misunderstood. It wasn't just the volume. The volume was great. We raised a lot of money, we made a lot of calls, we knocked on a lot of doors. It was the quality of the people having these conversations. And when the campaign that's being run against you, as Sarah Palin infamously said, was that Barack Obama does not see America like you or I do, he's palling around with terrorists, the best way to deal with that is not what Barack Obama said or Joe Biden said or what I said. It's what someone's neighbor said, who said, you know what, I've looked into that, and it's just he barely knew the guy. What's matter is who's going to fix the economy, who's going to change Washington. That's how this election was won, person by person, helping people sort through the election. And that's not sexy. And it wasn't understood, but it was our secret weapon.
You mentioned Sarah Palin, so let's talk about her a little bit. And the rest of the Republican field as well. Looking forward to 2012, it's clear right now that the Republicans have a little bit of a leadership problem. Who do you see filling that role as the leader on some of the more right-leaning issues, and who holds promise as far as who the president is going to be running against in 3 years?
Well, I'd start by saying, President Obama has told all of us that he doesn't want any of us worrying about or focusing on 2012 because we've got big challenges and big tasks, and the last thing that should be part of any decision making is that. And so this is just an amateur observation. First of all, this time 4 years ago, there wasn't anybody talking about Barack Obama running for president. So we've got the likely cast of Republican characters who may run, but there'll probably be new people emerge. Politics always surprises us, and so I think we should assume that the field will be different, and the likely nominee could be someone that we're barely registering on our screens right now. So I don't know. I don't really have thoughts on the individuals. I may have thoughts on Sarah Palin, but I'll get to 2012. I think they're having a big, they're going to have a big identity crisis in their party. Should they nominate someone who's right or center-right? Should they nominate someone who's their Obama or sort of their antidote to Obama, someone who's been around Washington for a longer time? But this will play itself out well before 2012. And I think I distinguish between Republicans and Washington Republicans. I think Republican voters and business leaders and some local Republican elected officials are out there trying to solve problems and cooperate where they can. The Washington Republicans have chosen a much different path. And I find it interesting that a party that has almost no support with Hispanic voters, young voters, independent voters, is offering either no new ideas or recycled Bush ideas. And they seem to be content to speak to the 30% of the people who still think George Bush was a good president. I do not think this is a recipe for electoral repair. But that being said, a lot can change. We live in a very fast-moving world. A year from now, we could be talking about the Senate Republican Party. We should not get comfortable if you're in my shoes. So, but I think it's going to be fascinating to play. They're even having these debates now. Should they offer positive, constructive alternatives or not? Should they just oppose? Right now, 75–80% of the electorate, so that means almost all Democrats and independents and some Republicans think Obama's trying to reach out to the other side. About 25% of the people think that of the Republicans, which means they're getting no Democrats or independents and even losing some Republicans. That is really dangerous and flying in the face of what the American people want and sent clearly in the last election. We want you all to act like adults and get along. Now, that doesn't mean they don't believe the opposition party doesn't have a role. They do. But when it's opposition based on principle, I think the sense from voters now is that in Washington, the Republicans are playing politics. And again, I think it's important to distinguish because there's plenty of Republicans out there who I think are doing smart things and want to cooperate while they can and oppose where they must. But I think right now, they're kind of searching for their identity and their strategy. And it's going to be fascinating to watch it play out in the next 3 years. I think it's going to be, I wish I could just sit back and eat popcorn and watch the movie because it's going to be fascinating.
I don't know that I'm going to have the chance to ask you this in 2012, so I'm going to ask you tonight. What was the Sarah Palin effect?
Well, I'd say this. I think she did end up being our best organizer and fundraiser. So, she helped in that regard. But I think the understanding about Palin, I think, really misses something fundamental, which is voters didn't vote for Obama or against McCain because they said, I didn't like the way Sarah Palin handled the Kerry Couric interview or the Tina Fey bit really spoke to me. Whenever voters talked about Sarah Palin, they didn't talk about Sarah Palin, they talked about John McCain. This was a very important decision. And they began to see two things about it. One, they found the whole process of picking her to be very erratic, and not the process they would want. The word erratic, something we began with Palin, and really around his comments about the economy and his behavior around the debate set in. He's erratic. Secondly, they saw it as very political, because he had been spending months and months saying Obama doesn't have the experience. Now he picks Palin. People went right, I'm not talking me, people, voters, went right to the politics of it. And that was damaging to McCain, because one of the dangers he presented it to us in the general election was the sense, particularly amongst many independent voters, that McCain wasn't all about politics, that he made important decisions sometimes without regard to the politics. And this began to erode him. The other thing that eroded him was the ads he was running. You know, Obama wants to teach sex education to kindergartners, and he's like Britney Spears and Paris Hilton. If Kerry or Bush or Gore had run those ads, it wouldn't have mattered, really. People expect that. They expected better from McCain, as they did from us. And those ads he were running really caused him damage with independent women in particular. So McCain eroded political capital that had been built up over 20 years. So I think it was more about what it said about McCain. And listen, the truth is she went out there and she got big crowds, and the RNC raised a lot of money, and a lot of that was probably because of Palin. So I think there's areas where Palin probably helped them a great deal. But I think on the whole, it did damage to McCain because he came across as political, and they really thought the process he used to pick her was not what they thought should be done.
David, it has been a pleasure getting to talk to you, and this is all the time that Malcolm and I have for questions, but we're going to hand it back over to Director Purcell for questions from the audience. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Not too bad.
All right, it wouldn't be a forum without questions from our audience. The microphones are on both levels, up above and down below. As you know, a question here at the forum always is short, concise, clear, ends in a question mark. And with that understanding, we'll begin right over here.
Sir, my name is Jessica Schrader, Master in Public Policy student here. Thank you for coming. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how you kept your campaign so airtight and disciplined.
Well, it's a good question. I mean, we tried to follow as little from the Bush years as we could. But one thing they did well, and they did more than one thing well, they had a very tight campaign in both 2000 and 2004. In fact, they had an inner circle, I think it was 5 people, and their rule was no one could be allowed in without someone being kicked out. They were serious about this. And why that's important, this sounds really silly, but in most presidential campaigns, a conference call or meeting, you have to worry about the contents of that discussion getting out and people interpreting their role in it. It's a really toxic thing. We didn't want to have that, and we didn't. And it allowed us, so that didn't mean that we didn't want to be a transparent campaign about important things, but how we made decisions, you know, we thought that that was nothing that voters were interested in, certainly, but it's something the press was very interested in. And we wanted our message to get out, not the tactics of how we made decisions. And so we, from the very beginning, told people that's the kind of campaign we wanted to run. We were a very open campaign. We listened to people who have better ideas to execute, their own ideas about how to reach voters in their area. We let our staff really flourish. But the big things, message and strategy, were not debatable. We were not a democracy in that regard. That was set. And that gave people comfort because they knew where we were driving. I also think a lot of great people gravitated to Obama's campaign. I've talked about the volunteers, but also staff. None of us were there thinking that this was the pathway to the Oval Office. I mean, this was highly improbable. And so we were all there for the right reasons. Many of us had been in politics for a long time and were cynical, like the voters were. The quality of candidates, the lack of volunteerism. I worked on Governor Patrick's race in 2006 and saw it opened my eyes up to the power of technology and that grassroots people could come in and help deliver an improbable victory. So it made me gravitate even more to Barack's race because I thought this is the way politics could be. Even though the odds are really low, we could for a year go out there and work for somebody we believed in, who was going to speak honestly, speak like adults to voters, not just engage in sound bites. And so really good people gravitated to the campaign. And I had great senior staff who really hung the moon, and then even our organizers out there. We had these wonderful people who gave up jobs or other lucrative careers, took time off to say, I want to go organize in Iowa or New Hampshire for you. And they were the most talented people you'd ever want to see. So we just had a great culture, and that all stems from him. He was just a sane human being who treated people well. And I think a lot of people didn't want to let him down because in that really hot crucible, I mean, it is a brutal obstacle course, you know, he held himself up well into a higher standard. But it was really important that we were able to make decisions privately and to really just try and have in the media in front of voters what we thought they cared about, not the inner workings of a campaign, which no voter cares about. So,
up here?
Yeah. What are the chances of Barack Obama being reelected in 2012?
Well, I don't really want to get into 2012. I think we've got big enough problems on his plate and our plate that that election should be the least of our concerns. I would just comment, I'll comment on some things that happened in 2008 that may have application in 2010, 2012, 2016. So it's not specific to 2012. You know, there were some pretty big things that happened in the election that, you know, in the world we live in, the election happens and the next day we move on to something else. And there isn't the observation that perhaps there used to be. What happened in the western part of the country was enormously important. George Bush won Colorado and Nevada by comfortable margins and won New Mexico. Won all three. Barack Obama wins all three states by landslides. So in 4 years, you had movement of 15, 16 points. Virginia wasn't even close. We win it by 7 points. That was a shift of about 17 points. We win North Carolina and Indiana, shifts of double digits. Indiana, shift of over 20 points. Florida, we don't just win it, we do it by registering and turning out base voters who were hard to get registered and vote. So, you know, a presidential election is not about the tactic of the day or where the National Gallup poll stands. In fact, it's irrelevant. It is a puzzle. How can you piece together the states to get you to 270 electoral votes? And there's some things that happened in 2008 that ought to concern the other party. Because those western states I mentioned, and by the way, if McCain hadn't been from Arizona, I think we probably would have won that and with some comfort. Those are considered historically either lean or solid Republican states. You would consider all the western states now either toss-ups or lean Obama or lean Democrat. Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, these are always very close races. We win all those states by double digits, Iowa too. Oregon, Washington, always close, within a couple of points. Obama wins them without really a fight. He had a unique appeal in the Northwest and the upper Midwest. That was a real important part of the puzzle. Democrats normally have to defend that turf. We didn't have to do that very aggressively. So there's a lot of things that happened in 2008 that bear watching. Now, again, things can turn on a dime. By 2012, some of what I said may not hold true. And I think you can never be bound by the history of past races. But some really important things happen. Hispanic vote. We win more of the Hispanic vote, 67%, than any Democrat or Republican in the history of this country. Okay? It's growing as a very important demographic in a lot of battleground states. We win young voters by 40 points, and they proved that they could turn out. Independent voters, decisive victory. Shifts with white men and white women of big margins in a lot of states. So a lot of good things happened on that night on November 4th. What that means for 4 years from now, I think we should be careful to apply too much to that. But, you know, again, back to my premise that a presidential race is not a national election. What matters is who can put together the electoral votes. And our strategy was much different. And it was largely ridiculed when we went after Indiana and North Carolina and Virginia and Montana. You know, even people in our party said, you know, knock it off. Okay, this is going to come down to Ohio and Pennsylvania like it always does. Our view was we wanted as many pathways to 270 as possible. So if we lost some of our targets, we could still win. And we thought Obama had the appeal, we had the volunteers, and we would have the money to prosecute those campaigns at a high level, and we did. And obviously, you know, we won 365 electoral votes. That wasn't in the plan. That was a lot of electoral votes. We won with some margin. So we won most of the states we targeted. But if we hadn't, we had margin. And that's what we aimed for. And that was really important.
My question is, did you ever view our past Governor Mitt Romney as a potential end candidate from a strategy point of view against Obama?
As the presidential nominee?
As the president, yes.
Well, honestly, we were so busy dealing with Hillary Clinton, we didn't have much time to gaze down the field. Seriously.
Yeah.
I probably watched 2 Republican debates. I mean, we had our own fight. I do know that as McCain began his resurgence in November, December, we were very disappointed by that. Because there was nobody in the Republican field that contested us for independent votes in New Hampshire.
Right, yeah. Because so Mitt was next door here.
But he had appeal with Republicans, not many independents. That was a real problem for us. And so we also thought McCain would be the strongest general election candidate, but at that point we were just concerned about New Hampshire, not about the general election. So no, I think, I thought that Romney might be a good vice presidential pick for McCain. Yeah. Maybe because of his economic, it was less that. you know, I find it to be fairly artificial, but he just goes out there every day and executes. And he would be a burr in our saddle every day. You know, he'd go out there with the snappy line, and, you know, he would deliver it, and he would work hard. And, you know, I didn't think there was much downside. So we were already ready for Romney. I mean, we began the week before the pick saying, you know, great, pick Romney. They're doubling down on, you know, a lot of houses and bad economic policy. You know, I mean, we were just going to twin them together in that way.
Right.
We didn't have quite the strategy developed on Palin. We had to kind of make that up as we went along. But so, you know, the truth is that was a very close race. You know, Romney came close in Florida, South Carolina. If things had bounced a little bit differently, you know, it would have been Romney and Obama. But I think McCain was a tougher candidate for us than Romney. Even with some of McCain's mistakes, he had appeal to independent voters that Romney would not have, in my view.
Well, can I tell you, we'd just like to thank you for getting Obama elected.
Well,
we appreciate it.
thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I was actually wondering about Organizing for America. Do you think that it has a potential, anyway, to become more of a populist instrument that can thwart thoughtful policy analysis, and, you know, just by having this, maybe not a full aspect of a campaign, but, you know, certain elements of, you know, a campaign and organizing through your community?
Well, I think, you know, policy development won't be done through Organizing for America. You know, in the campaign, obviously, we developed message and strategy and then implemented it. That all emanates from the White House, obviously. Organizing for America is simply a way to communicate to people what the president's trying to do and ask them to get involved. But again, the power of Americans out there deciding to engage with their coworkers and their neighbors and calling people and canvassing people to talk about, here's what his health care plan is and what he's trying to get done and why it's important, energy plan. Again, even if there was no benefit to the president, I think that's a wonderful thing for our democracy. And I think it's great to have people out there debating energy, debating health care. And even if people decide that they're not supporting the president on it, or they may support elements of it but not all of it, they're going to appreciate the engagement. And again, just the sheer exercise of sharing videos from the president and the message of what we're trying to do to voters and to Americans is really, really important. And I think is really underappreciated by political observers. It was in the campaign, it is now. Because there's no price you can pay or you can attach to having millions of message ambassadors out there. And that's what we have every day. So, you know, hopefully it reconnects people. You know, I think that the White House website is much redesigned and getting a lot more traffic, and people are contributing their own ideas. It's one of the great things of our campaign is, you know, we did get a lot of ideas from people out in the country on organizing, on policy, and I think that's something the president values.
Second balcony right here.
Hi, my name is Megan Tybus. I'm an MPP student here. And not to go back to Organizing for America again, but a couple weeks ago, The Economist suggested that the Obama White House was falling into the permanent campaign mode, and that, in fact, the Organizing for America initiative was bringing the idea of the permanent campaign to unprecedented levels, and that initiative may actually sort of assist the Republicans in playing politics as usual, this sort of permanent campaign mentality in Washington. So I was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Well, I think it's largely nonsense. If I were to design a permanent campaign, it would be much different than Organizing for America. Its intent is to just go out there and communicate with people about issues, what the president's trying to do. We'll also try and get people involved in community service, which is another way to contribute outside the legislative process. But no, I think the ones that are engaged in kind of campaign tactics now are the Republicans in Washington, who, you know, through their quarterback Newt Gingrich and their announcer Rush Limbaugh, have decided to oppose at all costs and offer nothing constructive. And you know what, again, things can change. Maybe a year from now we'll be talking about the resurgence of the Republican Party. But I think they're in very dangerous waters because the American people are in a much different place. They want positive solutions. They want Republicans, Democrats, and independents to get along. They rejected the Bush economic policies as thoroughly as could be. And so I think it's dangerous territory. So No, I think Organizing for America is just a way for millions of Americans, including people who weren't involved in the campaign but want to pitch in on helping pass health care or energy, to do so. But again, it is not a campaign structure, and far from it, really.
You can stay up on the balcony for one more question.
Okay. My question is, was there any time you regretted not choosing Mrs. Clinton? And what was the strategic reason you didn't choose her as the vice presidential candidate? Thank you.
Well, I think President Obama's view on the vice presidential candidate was the most important thing was to get somebody that he was comfortable with serving as his vice president after the election. And I think that was the right approach. We also believe that historically vice presidential candidates don't have a deep impact on the election. Now this happened to be an exception to that on the other side, thankfully. So we didn't say who's going to help us win a state or who's going to help fundamentally shift the election. You know, you didn't want anybody who was going to do any harm. And Joe Biden certainly helped us. He was someone who could really talk to working class, middle class voters. As Barack Obama, you know, there was some speculation that we ought to pick another Obama-like person, so we kind of doubled down on change. But as Barack Obama would often say himself, you know, Barack Obama's enough change for people. we kind of have that cornered. And people liked having someone like Biden around who had both domestic and foreign policy experience. So I think he approached us in the right way. It was a very orderly process as opposed to the McCain process. It was tightly held. It's a very personal decision. So unlike most decisions where, you know, it was really just me and Axelrod and President Obama working through this. You know, we didn't say this is what we think you should do, and then he made, you know, we stood back and he had to make this decision because it was a very personal and important one. And I think he made the right decision. And Joe Biden out there, you know, there was a couple times where he'd said something that became newsmaking, obviously. But you knew that was kind of the deal. You'd get some of those days. But what he did day in and day out, and this is reflective of how we viewed the campaign, what was on CNN or MSNBC or Fox wasn't how we judged how we were doing. How are we doing in the states? And what Joe Biden did every day was he'd go to Toledo, Ohio, and he'd go to Terre Haute, Indiana, and he'd go to Springfield, Missouri, and he would just relentlessly drive